To survive in America, immigrants depended on each other. The first and most important resource was family. Immigrants often traveled to America alone, but they usually moved in with a relative who had come earlier. 3 or even 4 generations lived together, sharing salaries and expenses. The next level of support was the ethnic community.
Within their neighborhoods, they got more together, and they maintained their traditions and their values. That was an important resource for them, and they did that largely on an informal basis. But they also did it more formally by forming associations and organizations to protest against discrimination, and also in certain instances to go to employers as an organized group and see that doors were open to them.
So you might belong to a benefit society where every week you paid in a little bit of money, and then if the breadwinner in the family was hurt on the job, the benefit society would pay back some money to help the family get through. Because remember, this is a time before any kind of workman's compensation, before unemployment insurance, before any of that safety net that we are aware of today.
Ethnic newspapers, written in native tongues, provided ties to the old country as they helped immigrants adjust to the new. Ethnic grocery stores offered the tastes of home.
Another way they could go around is actually to change the politics of the situation. We have many immigrant groups who decide to do their best to take over local political organizations. So the Irish are very, very good at this in many American cities in the Northeast. And that will provide many opportunities for Irishmen when you can start electing Irish local politicians who can provide jobs, who can provide all sorts of services to Irish immigrant communities.
In the words of New York City political boss George Washington Plunkett in 1905,
"If there's a fire in 9th, 10th, or 11th Avenue any hour of the day or night, I'm usually there as soon as the fire engines. If a family is burned out, I buy clothes for them and fix them up till they get things running again. It's philanthropy, but it's politics too. Mighty good politics. Who can tell how many votes one of these fires brings me? The poor are the most grateful people in the world, and let me tell you, they have more friends in their neighborhoods than the rich have in theirs."
Our dollar bills say e pluribus unum, from the many, one. But how could so many diverse peoples become one? In 1909, Jewish playwright Israel Zangwill offered his own answer. Their cultural differences would melt away.
There she lies, the great melting pot. Listen, can't you hear the roaring and the bubbling? Oh, what a stirring and seething! Celt and Latin, Slav and Teuton, Greek and Syrian, black and yellow, how the great alchemist melts and fuses them with his purging flame. Here shall they all unite to build the Republic of Man and the Kingdom of God.
Zangwill, an immigrant himself, thought this melting process would happen naturally. But other Americans were not so sure. Immigrants from countries like Italy, Poland, and China were so different, they said, that special efforts would be needed to Americanize them. Employers led the way, designing programs to make their immigrant workers more American. Special classes helped the workers learn English and tried to promote thriftiness, cleanliness, and punctuality.
Public schools were obviously the most important institution that the immigrant family confronted because children were required by law to go to school, and here the language was taught, the culture was taught, and it was a very important force for Americanizing these children.
Education was free. That subject my father had written about repeatedly as comprising his chief hope for us children. The essence of American opportunity, the treasure that no thief could touch, not even misfortune or poverty. It was the one thing that he was able to promise us when he sent for us, surer, safer than bread or shelter. No application made, no questions asked, no examinations, rulings, exclusions, no machinations, no fees. The doors stood open for every one of us.
By 1908, over half of the students in urban public schools had a father who was born abroad. In New York City, the fraction was almost 3/4. Educators used the public schools to provide immigrant children a crash course in American values and habits.
These people tend to settle in groups or settlements and to set up here their national manners, customs, and observances. Our task is to break up these groups or settlements, to assimilate these people as part of our American race, and to implant in their children, so far as can be done, the Anglo-Saxon conception of righteousness, law, and order. Elwood Cubberley, 1909.
Insulted by the notion that their cultures were inferior, immigrant parents often sent their children to parochial schools. In Chicago, for example, over half of the Polish children attended a Catholic school.
I think it's wrong to assume that these children were, as a result of going to school, ready to drop the cultural traditions and language and so forth that they experienced at home, and in many cases they had memories of from their own early lives. And so I think what happens is that these children learn to live in both worlds, and that they mediate the message of the school.
But many immigrant youths tried to Americanize as quickly as possible. In millions of immigrant households, children and parents clashed.
My big, pretty daughter is not the girl I knew. I talk to her in Yiddish, and she replies in English. She doesn't like to have me light the Sabbath candles. When I light the candles, she blows them out. She makes fun of me and her father. She calls us greenhorns. Once, I saw her standing on the stoop with a boy. So I went up to her and asked her when she would come up. She did not even reply because I had called her by her Jewish name. But I cannot call her by her new name.
Often immigrant children, that is, children of immigrants who had been born in the United States, were very embarrassed of the so-called greenhorn ways that their parents had. Their parents' accents or even their inability to speak English, the food that they cook, the clothes they wear. And so children would come back from school and they would say, I don't want to eat your sandwich, or I don't want to wear your clothes, or I don't want to speak your language because that's a reminder that I'm different.
Immigrant children often received their new names in public schools. In one New York school, Esther Oberrein became Esther O'Brien. In another, Giuseppe Vagnati became Mike Jones. When a teacher changed Leonardo Coviello's name to Leonard Covello, which was easier for her to pronounce, his parents complained. But Leonard, a new American, sided with the teacher.
What happened to the E in Coviello? You don't change a family name.
You don't understand.
Will you stop saying that? What is there to understand? Now that you've become Americanized, you understand everything, and I understand nothing.
Many Native Americans believed that the new wave of immigrants could never be Americanized. As more and more newcomers poured into the country, some began calling for restrictions on their entry.
If you go to the West Coast, the Chinese who arrive, starting in the 1840s, meet a very hostile reception. And sometimes often a hostile reception from American workers who think the Chinese are taking their jobs or depressing the wages of other people. And there's tremendous hostility.
In 1876, white manual laborers formed the California Workingmen's Party, dedicated to ridding the state of what it called the Yellow Peril.
3 years later, California held a whites-only referendum on excluding the Chinese. Final vote, 150,000 for exclusion, 900 against. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred further entry of Chinese laborers for 10 years.
Urban poverty and disease, coupled with the labor conflicts of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, also fueled calls for the exclusion of Poles, Jews, Russians, and others considered to be lesser immigrants. Spouting a new brand of so-called scientific racism, critics charged that these groups were diluting the genetic stock of Anglo-Saxon America.
From the rate at which immigrants are increasing, it is obvious that our very lifeblood is at stake. There is a great hazard in the mongrelizing of distinctly unrelated races. Michael F. Geyer, 1916.
Scientific racism was an attempt to give the aura or the authority of science to the racist idea that there was a rung or a hierarchy of peoples, that the Anglo-Saxon people were superior, and it went down from there. Other peoples, including Slavs, Jews, blacks, were somewhat lower on the ladder.
Unlike the Chinese, Southern and Eastern Europeans were never excluded outright from America's shores. In the 1920s, however, Congress would enact new restrictions that sought to return America to its ethnic balance of the 1890s, before the huge influx of Italians, Jews, Slavs, and Poles. But there was no turning back. For in America's cities, the new immigrants had already created a new urban culture.